Hello, welcome to Anatomy and Physiology 1. During this online lecture, we're going to be talking about the skin. This is an overview of the skin. The skin is classified as a cutaneous membrane. So anytime you see the term cutaneous, we're talking about the skin. The skin is really a barrier from the hostile external environment that we're in all the time, barrier between that and our internal environment. And it has this remarkable ability to repair itself. It's a major component of our body's structural framework, with its primary functions being to support and protect, as we'll learn today. It is the largest organ, it's the thinnest, but it plays a very important role. The size of the skin is going to vary depending on the size of the individual. The skin is a part of the integumentary system, one of the many systems in our body that we're going to be going through in this course. And the skin is the biggest part of our integumentary system. But our hair, our nails, and our skin glands also play a component. And we will touch upon a couple of these as well during the lecture, with the focus being the skin. Skin functions are very important in order to maintain homeostasis. We're going to be going through each of these individually and elaborating on later slides, but we're going to look at the functions protection, sensation, flexibility, excretion, immunity, and a couple of other functions. Let's have a look at the protection features. First of all, the skin is a physical barrier to microorganisms, so it acts really just as a barrier to them entering into our body, but we also have surface films on our skin that contribute to this as well. The skin is a barrier to chemicals that the body is exposed to. Tissue strength contributes to reducing the incidence of mechanical trauma. The skin also prevents or protects us against dehydration that would occur if we lost our internal body fluids. Our skin also protects us against the harmful effects of overexposure to UV light, and this is due to a pigment melanin. And of course, not everybody possesses the same quantity of it. In other words, we produce different amounts than each other, and more melanin equates to more UV protection. Another function of skin is sensation. There are millions of different somatic or body sensory receptors that are found throughout our skin that allow for sensations such as pressure and touch and temperature and pain. And being able to detect these differences is important for our survival. We often say, well, it's too bad we experience pain, but if we didn't experience pain, we would actually be worse off. Flexibility. For our body to be able to move without damage, our skin must be supple and elastic. It must grow as we grow and have the abilities to stretch and recoil, otherwise tearing and cuts would occur. Excretion. Our skin, this is more of a minor role, but our skin can regulate the volume and chemical content of our sweat. And so our skin has the ability to influence the amount of water and waste products that are in our body. And some of the waste products we're talking about are urea, ammonia, and uric acid. As I said, this is a more minor role compared to some of the other skin functions, but still an important one. In terms of immunity, our skin possesses defense cells, which are immune cells that contribute to our immune system. For example, we have these phagocytic cells that have the ability to engulf, which is the process is called phagocytose, and destroy bacteria. For example, we have epidermal dendritic cells, and these ones are going to help specifically trigger a helpful immune reaction within our skin to ward off infection. And they work with other cells that are called helper T cells or helper immune cells. And you'll learn a lot more about these cells when you get to the immune system lecture next term. Other functions of the skin include the production of vitamin D. So when your skin is exposed to UV light, the body can begin its production of vitamin D. So we produce vitamin D then based on our exposure to UV light. And so when we're exposed to UV light, this ultimately allows your kidneys and your liver to produce an active form of vitamin D. And vitamin D is a very important vitamin for many chemical reactions within our body, and is oftentimes considered to be a hormone as well. Now, because it's not great for us to always just be sitting in the sun just to make vitamin D because of the risk of skin cancer, there are lots of supplements available now where you can take vitamin D, and vitamin D is huge for your immune system and might be something to make sure you at least look into taking, in particular during the cold and flu season. And then finally, our skin allows for homeostasis of body temperature, and that is a requirement for survival. Think back to our discussion on negative feedback and temperature control. The many processes that occur in our body are going to depend on a very specific body temperature in order to operate properly. Now on to talking about the structures that make up your skin. The two primary layers of your skin are the epidermis and the dermis. The epidermis is more superficial. So if you look at these terms here, epi oftentimes means on top of. So you can think of this as the layer, the epidermis is the layer on top of the dermis, because you should be aware of which one's more superficial and which one's more deep. So again, epidermis, this is the top layer, it's the more superficial layer, it's also the thinner layer. And we can see it shown here, but in terms of really seeing its size, you can see here. Now the dermis is a dense vascular layer of connective tissue. You can see there's a lot of vessels here, hence the term vascular. It is thicker than the epidermis and deeper. And so we can remember again that the dermis is going to be found beneath the epidermis. The area where the cells of the epidermis meet with the cells of the dermis is called the dermoepidermal junction, which is a handy name for that area where two components join. This is where your basement membrane is found. The basement membrane of a structure will separate the epithelial layer that has all of your epithelial cells that make up the tissue from the connective tissue beneath it. And it's considered to be a barrier, this basement membrane, but only a partial barrier because it does allow for the passage of some cells and molecules. You can think of this area as, or this layer as being sort of the glue that holds the epidermis and the dermis together. So this line right here. The hypodermis, which is also known as the subcutaneous layer or the superficial fascia, this is found beneath the dermis. So hypo means below or lower than, and then sub also means below, if that helps you remember where they're located. This layer is not considered a primary layer of skin, and it's made up of a layer of fat or adipose tissue. It's also made up of loose fibrous connective tissue, which you might recall from our tissues lecture. And so it's the hypodermis that's going to allow for a connection between the skin above it and the underlying structures beneath it. And if we look at it up here, what you can really identify is the fat, the adipose tissue, and that is usually represented by a yellow color. We can classify skin as being thick or thin. Most of the body surface is covered by thin skin, but the hairless skin that covers the palms of your hands and your fingertips and the soles of your feet are classified as thick skin. And it's thicker in particular because these areas are subject to more friction, but we'll talk about a couple of other reasons as well. So this slide is going to compare thick and thin skin. So we'll just go through this. Together we have thick skin being quite a bit thicker than thin skin. No hair on thick skin compared to thin. Thick skin has friction ridges, which you can see in the image here, whereas thin skin does not. It has more of a smooth appearance. In terms of layers, thick skin has more layers. The term strata refers to layers, and that will become relevant soon. But thick skin has more layers, and specifically if we look at the top layer, you'll learn this soon, the stratum corneum is the top layer. that very top layer, it is thicker. There are more layers of it, of cells, than what we would see in thin skin. Location, we've already spoken about, and then function, thick skin is going to be found, we know, in areas where there's going to be more friction, but it's also found in areas where sensation is a little bit more important. In order for you to properly pick up something and manipulate something, we need to have good sensory function. And then thin skin possesses most of our normal skin functions. Now we're going to look at some of the cell types that make up the epidermis. Remember, the epidermis is that top layer of skin. The first one we're going to have a look at are the keratinocytes. Cytes means cell. Keratinocytes are cells that eventually become filled with this tough, fibrous protein that's called keratin. So they're cells that are going to be filled with keratin, which is, again, a tough, fibrous protein. And it is keratinocytes that are the principal structural element in our outer skin, and they make up the majority of the what we can call epidermal cells that are present in our skin, up to 90%. Now, once keratinocytes become full of keratin, so they're fully keratinized, they're actually considered to be dead. And so then they get the name corneocytes after they've been keratinized. And so let's look at the image here of our epidermal skin, that top layer. And these guys here are the keratinocytes. And they will become full of keratin, and they migrate up. We'll talk more about that soon. And then they become these dead cells that are eventually, when you have dry skin, what sheds off. Next up are melanocytes. Melanocytes contribute to colored pigment in the skin. They serve to reduce the amount of UV light that can penetrate into the deeper layers of skin. So ultimately what they do is they protect our DNA from damage. So these look like these here. So again, these are going to produce the pigment melanin, which will protect against sun damage, but these only make up about 5% of our total epidermal cells. There is a condition called vitiligo, and Michael Jackson stated that he had vitiligo, and that's where there was the change in color of his skin. So he had, and anyone with vitiligo will have a loss of pigment in certain areas of their skin. It can be patchy in some people and more widespread in others. So sufferers of this condition actually lose the melanin that actually gave them the pigment that they had. Next up is epidermal dendritic cells. That was an immune cell that I had mentioned earlier when we started this lecture. They're also called Langerhans cells. We'll have a look at what these look like here. They have a pretty definitive appearance. These are branch cells, which you can clearly see in the image, and they're, as I said, involved in our immunity. These are actually a type of what's called an APC, or an antigen presenting cell. And this means that dendritic cells, and in this case they're called epidermal dendritic because they're just found in the epidermis, but dendritic cells are found in different areas of the body. Dendritic cells have this ability to go around and find some sort of marker that's called an antigen. So some sort of marker that might be on, let's say, a bacteria. It's going to take that marker and present it, so the marker's the antigen, present it to our immune system. Basically saying, hey, look what I found in the body that shouldn't be here, or in the skin that shouldn't be here. Why don't you take care of it, to the other immune cell? Lastly, we have what are called tactile epithelial cells, also known as Merkel cells. These are found in the deepest layer of the epidermis, as you can see from the image. So that's this here. And as you can also see, they're going to be able to form a connection. More specifically, they'll form a connection with sensory nerve endings. So I'll bring that up here That's E. So this is a sensory nerve ending. Here's your Merkel cell that's connected with a sensory nerve ending. And by doing so, they form these structures that serve as light touch receptors. So it's your ability then to perceive light touch if someone touches you lightly is because these Merkel cells have formed a connection with these sensory nerve endings here, which then connect through nerves to our central nervous system, allowing us to process, oh, somebody just brushed their, elbow against me. Okay, so this layer here was our epidermis, and we talked about all the cells, a lot of the cells that are found within them. The cells of your epidermis are found in up to 5 layers. So there are 5 different layers then of the epidermis that contain many of the cells that we've spoken about. Strata, again, means layers, and each of the layers start with the term stratum. Each layer is named for its structural or functional characteristics, and the order that you can see here is listed from most superficial to most deep. Just to remind you, here is our epidermis. Here is our connective tissue layer, the dermis, and then our fatty layer, the hypodermis. Let's start with the most superficial layer, the stratum corneum. That's that layer that you can see here, and it is most superficial. This would be the layer that's exposed to the outside world, or at least this top part of it is. And it is filled or composed of dead cells that are filled with keratin. Remember, we talked about how when keratinocytes fill with keratin, they migrate more superficially, and then they become corneocytes, and at that point they are dead. And so that term corneocyte that I mentioned on this slide here is why we get the name stratum corneum. So this layer of dead skin, or dead cells we should say, is constantly being sloughed off and replaced by cells that migrate upwards. So when we shed this part off, then other cells, keratinocytes, will reach the top layer of skin, and it's just a constant cycle. This is also the layer that is thicker, as I had mentioned earlier, in thick skin, more layers in thick skin. The stratum lucidum, this layer is only found in thick skin, so it's absent in thin skin, and it's composed of dying cells that are filled with a substance called ellatin. And ellatin is a precursor to keratin. So because of ellatin, we can produce keratin. And that layer is shown here. Next up is the stratum granulosum. This is where the process of surface keratin formation begins. So cells are going to be arranged in a sheet that's about 2 to 4 layers deep, and they're filled with granules called keratohyalin. It is keratohyalin that is required for the formation of surface keratin. Remember that protein we talked about earlier. So these layers, I'll show you this layer here, this thinner layer here. The stratum granulosum has, the cells in this area have started to degenerate. And so there are high levels of lysosomal enzymes present. And remember from learning about cell function and structure, these are digestive enzymes. The stratum spinosum is formed from 8 to 10 layers of cells that are connected by desmosomes. Remember, we have spot and belt desmosomes that are a form of cell-to-cell connection. And the desmosomes pull the cells into sort of these spiny shapes, and that's why they get the name stratum spinosum or spiny layer. And let's have a look at those cells here. It's difficult to see, but you can look at some images even in your textbook to see the spiny appearance based on how these desmosomes hold each of these cells together. One of the features of the stratum spinosum layer is that the cells are very rich in RNA, ribosomal nucleic acid, and because they're rich in RNA, they are therefore able to begin the protein synthesis that's required for the production of keratin, which again is a protein. Stratum basale literally means base layer, so this is the lowest of the layer, think of the basement layer. And it also gets the name stratum germinativum, which refers to the growth layer. So this consists of a single layer of columnar, so that would be kind of taller cells. And only the cells that are within this deep layer are actually going to undergo the process of mitosis. So cells that are formed here in this layer, so the very bottom part of the epidermis, these cells are going to undergo mitosis. So this single layer, this simple columnar epithelial tissue is going to undergo mitosis, and then the cells are going to rise up, making their way to the top where they will be sloughed off, eventually shed off, but then we're continually replacing it. So having this layer intact obviously is important for the development of new skin. The ability of our skin to repair itself after injury or damage is very important. Turnover time and regeneration time are terms that are used to describe the time frame required for a population of cells to mature and reproduce. It refers to the time it takes for the cell to have been created in that stratum basale, that basement layer, not basement membrane, but like the base layer, to migrate to the surface of the skin. And so this takes about 35 days. So let's look at this image here. This layer here is your stratum basale. And cells that undergo mitosis here are going to travel to the top where they'll be sloughed off. And this process of going from here to here takes about 35 days. A cell signaling protein that's called epidermal growth factor plays a role in regulating the regeneration and repair of the epidermis, as the name suggests. It is a factor that contributes to the growth of epidermal cells. Epidermal growth factor requires insulin-like growth factor to have in order for it to have its full effect in stimulating skin growth and repair. Growth hormone has a growth-promoting effect as well. Now, if abrasion to the skin occurs over a long period of time, a thicker stratum corneum can develop due to an increase in mitotic division and a shorter turnover time. And this causes what you might know of as a callus if you do a lot of writing and you have that sort of bump on the side of one of your fingers, such as your middle finger, or if you play guitar and you have a callus that's developed, or even a callus on your foot because of friction between your shoe and your skin. And so you develop a thicker layer of the stratum corneum just to help resist some of that stress, that friction. Now, normally about 10 to 12% of all cells in that stratum basale are going to enter mitosis each day. 10 to 12%. Cells migrating to the surface proceed upward in these vertical columns of around 8 to 10 basal cells along with keratinocytes, and we call this an epidermal proliferating unit. So in other words, it consists of proliferating cells, the ones that are undergoing mitosis, and the non-proliferating cells, which are the keratinocytes. So to explain that again, cells undergoing mitosis here are going to move up, and then they're going to be moving along with cells that are already here that are called keratinocytes, that once they reach the surface of the skin become your corneocytes. Now we move on to talking about the dermis. We spoke quite a bit about the epidermis. The dermis we know is found beneath the epidermis. So here's all your epidermis. There's that stratum basal. This here is the dermis. The dermis is sometimes referred to as the true skin because it's much thicker than the overlying epidermal layer. It consists of two layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer, both of which are comprised of connective tissue that contains both fine collagenous and elastic fibers. Now looking at each of them independently for a moment, papillary layer is a thinner layer than the reticular layer that's found beneath it. And it's found just below that dermo-epidermal junction that we spoke about before. And it consists of these bumps that project into the epidermis that is actually responsible for creating your fingerprints. So let's have a look at that here. That's going to be this layer here that you can see creates almost these bumps that push up against the epidermis, which contributes then to your fingerprints. And fingerprints are unique to each individual, even in identical twins. The reticular layer below it, it's thicker. It's going to contribute a lot to what makes your skin tough, but it's also stretchable. And that's because it has some elastic fibers in it as well. It's this layer in animals that when they're commercially processed, it forms leather. The various functions of the dermis layer include protection against chemical and mechanical injury, as well as protection against compression, body temperature regulation through blood vessels dilating, so widening, and then blood vessels constricting, so closing or shrinking in diameter. It offers nutrient supply and waste removal from the epidermis, okay, because of its being highly vascularized. Remember from an earlier slide, and this area is not, it allows for removal of waste products, but also delivery of nutrients. It also permits the feedback of information to our central nervous system about our external environment, and we'll learn about that more when we get to the nervous system unit. And it's also a point of attachment for many of our voluntary, so that means what we have control over, and our involuntary, what we don't have control over, muscles throughout our body. And again, that'll be a topic that we'll get into more once we get to the muscular system unit. Now we're going to talk about some of the components that make up the dermis, and make sure you always look at your slide heading so that you know what content the slide is discussing. As you can see from this image, there are numerous different components that make up the dermis, or that are part of the dermis. First, we'll talk about blood vessels. There's a very rich vascular supply of the dermis, and it plays a critical role in temperature regulation, as mentioned earlier. So that's where you can have dilation and constriction, so widening and narrowing of the vessels in order to regulate temperature control, or in order to regulate temperature. There's also going to be nutrient and waste exchange within the epidermis, as we also know. So this area of the skin can be fed with nutrients, but also drained of any waste products by all the blood vessels that are found within the dermis. We also have some muscles, very small muscles called erector, which means to stand up tall, pili muscles. And then we'll show you hair follicles as well. So we've got, first of all, these muscles here that you can see are attached to the hair. So each hair follicle, that's a hair follicle, has a small bundle of these involuntary, meaning you don't have control over it, muscles attached to it that are called the erector pili muscles. And during instances of fright or cold, these muscles contract and cause the hair on your arms, for example, to stand up. We also have sensory receptors that are found that allow within the dermis that allow us to experience sensations such as pain and pressure and touch and temperature, and then these sensations, when they're picked up, can travel back to the central nervous system where we can perceive them for what they are. And finally, the presence of glands. So sweat and sebaceous glands are going to allow for the production of sweat externally, so an external secretion, and sebaceous glands, which produce an oil. And that's shown as C and D here. So what those glands do produce would be released onto the surface of the skin. Still on the topic of components of the dermis, but we're going to look at the erector pili and the sensory receptors, which were introduced here. In this image on the left, you can visualize the contraction of an erector pili muscle, which allows the hair, when contracted, to stand up erect, and then you can see that goosebump appearance. And it gets the name because of what a goose's skin would look like when a feather was plucked. In the image on the right, we can see two different types of sensory receptors. We have tactile Meissner corpuscle and lamellar Pacinian corpuscle, and then the associated image above. The tactile Meissner corpuscles are more superficial, and the lamellar or Pacinian are deeper. And I'm just going to go back to this image here. And what I can show you here is that I represents the Meissner corpuscle, and you can see it's more superficial in this region here. It is part of the underneath the epidermis. When we get into these deeper layers, we can see this one is sort of a butting up against the epidermis. That's the Meissner corpuscle, and then the Pacinian corpuscle are found lower within the hypodermis, but abutting up against, in many cases, against the dermis that is above it. In terms of function, it is the more superficial tactile Meissner corpuscle that is involved in our ability to detect light touch, whereas the lamellar Pacinian corpuscles, the deeper ones, are also involved in detecting touch sensations, but from a deep pressure perspective. So the deeper ones of the two is responsible for deep pressure. So in terms of dermal growth and repair, I want you to recall that the epidermis sheds and then it renews continually, but the dermis does not have this ability. So in the case of a wound or an injury to the dermis, we're going to have a cell called a fibroblast, shown here, that's going to begin to form a dense mass of new connective tissue, because this is a connective tissue layer, in order to replace the damaged tissue. Now, if this mass does not become normal tissue, we hope it would, but if it doesn't become normal tissue, then it's going to form a scar. So we can see all those small cells here that are working to rebuild the tissue. And you can see a scar has formed in this case here. We're going to talk about skin color, looking specifically at melanin. And we know that this is produced by melanocytes, and it is the primary determinant of our skin color. But the quantity, type, and distribution of melanin that somebody has is going to be influenced by your genetics or heredity, influenced by how much you're exposed to the sun, as well as hormones. Now, within melanocytes, we have this enzyme called tyrosinase. We also have amino acids called tyrosine. Tyrosinase is going to convert tyrosine into melanin within the melanocytes. Now, once melanin is produced, I'm just going to jump down here for a moment. It's going to be released in these packets that are called melanosomes. So let's have a look at this. Here's a melanocyte. Within the cell, we're going to have tyrosinase that converts tyrosine, an amino acid, into melanin. Melanin is going to be released in packets at a time. So here's a packet here of melanin. Here's another packet, here's another packet. And the melanosomes are going to be ingested by surrounding keratinocytes. And we know that keratinocytes are going to be those cells that make up our skin that migrate up towards the top and eventually become corneocytes. So they're going to ingest it. And then when they ingest the melanosome, it's going to form a cap over the nucleus. Now, if you think about it, why might that be important? Well, forming a cap on the nucleus, you can see all the melanin here, actually acts as a shield around our nucleus, protecting our DNA from damage and mutations that can be caused by being exposed to UV light. So you could see why somebody who produces a lot more melanin, the nucleus of their skin cells are protected, so the DNA is protected more than somebody who has less melanin, somebody such as myself. Now, it's not complete protection. Anybody can get skin cancer, but it is more likely to happen in people that have less melanin because they have less protection on their DNA. And as you'll probably learn in later courses, when UV light hits your DNA within your skin, it causes mutations to the DNA. And that can, with multiple exposures, lead to the development of skin cancer. So I'm going to jump back up now to the different types of melanin that exist. We have eumelanin and pheomelanin. Eumelanin is a darker brown, almost black melanin, and pheomelanin is a reddish orange melanin. We know the function is to contribute to skin color, and we also know that it's to filter out UV light and protect the DNA within our cells. There are some conditions relating to melanin, and I spoke about vitiligo already. And this is where your melanocytes aren't producing melanin like they were, and it can lead to patches of skin where melanin is not present. So a very fair area. And this can happen in people with all skin colors and all backgrounds. So they're referred to as inactive melanocytes. So they were once producing melanin, and now some of them are not, particularly in this area of skin. And then albinism, this is a congenital disorder. So that means it's something you're born with where you don't produce melanin. And the reason you don't produce melanin is because you don't have the enzyme that would break down the amino acid tyrosine to ultimately form melanin. Now, there are different degrees of albinism, but speaking just sort of basically, this is one of the reasons why their skin, people with albinism, their skin, their hair, and their eyes are so light in color. Still on the topic of skin tone, and we're going to look at the different contributors to skin tone. So the first one we know that contributes is our exposure to UV radiation. And what UV radiation does is it activates something called melanocortin's endothelin 1. And what this will do is increase the amount of melanin that is going to be produced by your melanocytes. So we know that melanin is that main skin pigment. There's also genetic control, so your genes can have control over how much melanin your body would ultimately produce, but also has a contributor to the amount of activation that occurs with melanocortin's endothelin 1. But in any case, the production of melanin we know is going to determine how much is actually deposited into your epidermis and therefore determining your skin color. A couple of other variables can also affect your skin color. So the volume of blood, the amount of blood that you have in your skin capillaries, which are small blood vessels in your skin, can also impact the color of your skin, and then the amount of what's called unoxygenated hemoglobin as well, you'll learn more about hemoglobin next term, can determine your skin color. And that's why all of us have different shades of skin. Let's have a look at what prolonged exposure to UV radiation or sunlight does to our skin. So before we get to these pictures, I'll start here at the top. If you're exposed to ultraviolet radiation for a long period of time, your melanocytes are going to increase the production of melanin. And we know melanin is a pigment that's going to darken the skin. And that's where if you go away and you come back, you get a tan, although I do not for some reason. So your skin color darkens, and a couple of things are going to be noted here. First of all, melanin we know is going to be released in those packets called melanosomes that are going to form a cap over the nucleus, and they're going to absorb the UV radiation to prevent it from hitting our DNA. Any cells that were damaged hopefully will undergo a process either where our body will repair the damaged DNA in the cell, or if it can't repair it, it will hopefully go through a process called apoptosis, which is a programmed cell death. So we want damaged cells that can't be repaired to die, otherwise they can lead to many different conditions, including, in this case, skin cancer. Eumelanin, we talked about eumelanin and pheomelanin. Eumelanin is that darker one that would make sense that it would absorb more UV radiation than pheomelanin. Now, if your cells are not protected by melanin, and this is where fair-skinned individuals like myself are more predisposed to this happening, but no one is fully protected, then what the UV radiation will do is it will break down a very vital vitamin called folic acid. And it can also reach the nucleus of the cells where it damages DNA, and as I already spoke about, can lead then to skin cancer. You can see in this image, this is the effect of tanning over about a 7-day period, and you can see the different effects that UV radiation would have in different skin colors or different skin types. So all are impacted, but the Caucasian skin would be more predisposed to damage. We're going to now talk about surface film of our skin. The ability of our skin to protect us from the damaging effects of the environment. So we're not talking about UV exposure or sun exposure right now. We're saying just in general, the ability to protect against the hostile external environment around us. It begins with proper functioning of surface film. And this is a thin film of emulsified material that's spread over the surface of the skin. And it's formed by the mixing of secretions from your sweat and your sebaceous, which is oil glands. It also is contributed by any of the dead skin cells that have been sloughed off. And that sloughed off process is called desquamation. And to help you remember that, like that prefix is referring to, in this case, lack of or removal of. Squamation, remember those are squamous cells. They're flat, scaly cells on the surface of our skin. So a combination of the skin cells that are being sloughed off and secretions from sweat and sebaceous glands produce this film that acts as a protective barrier. In terms of the actual chemical composition of what I just mentioned, the epithelial or cells that are sloughed off through desquamation are going to be filled with amino acids, sterols, complex phospholipids. Sterols are just like a lipid steroid. Sebum, which is oil, is going to consist of fatty acids, triglycerides, and waxes. And then our sweat is going to be composed of water, ammonia, urea, lactic acid, and uric acid. Functions of the surface film are going to be protecting from microbes. So anti means against, antibacterial, antifungal, against funguses, helps block some toxic agents that we're exposed to, and is a buffer against caustic agents or irritants, which are just chemical irritants. The surface film allows for lubrication as well as hydration of the skin surface. We're going to return to talking about vitamin D for a moment, and we've already discussed how its production involves your skin, the liver, and the kidney. The first step that's needed for this pathway is your skin has to be exposed to UV light in order to make vitamin D and convert it to its active form. And this pathway can actually be prevented or affected in individuals who have too much melanin because they're not able to absorb the UV rays the same way as people that have less amount of melanin. And all you need to know from this diagram here is that it starts in the skin, and then between the liver and the kidney, we form the active form of vitamin D, which plays a role in many different functions in the body. Our body has the ability to maintain homeostasis of body temperature by either conserving heat or increasing heat loss. And the body must constantly work to balance heat production and heat loss in order to keep us well. Heat is produced by one means, and that's the metabolism of foods. And our skeletal muscles and liver are examples of very active organs that undergo metabolism and produce heat. And this can increase these metabolic processes and the production of heat depending on how hard, for example, your muscles are working. In terms of heat loss, 80% or more is lost through your skin and 20% is lost through mucosa of your respiratory, digestive, and urinary tracts. Evaporation is an example of how the body can lose heat in order to cool down. So heat gets transferred from your blood vessels to your epidermis, which allows for heat loss. And that's important when you're in a hot environment in order to cool your body down. When we look at heat conservation, here's your skin. Here are larger blood vessels, and these are the smaller blood vessels called capillaries. And the capillaries are what are going to actually reach your tissues. And what we can see in this example, when we don't want to lose heat, we want to conserve heat, these have constricted, which encourages blood to move elsewhere. In an example where we need to lose heat because our body's getting too hot, let's say we're in a hot environment or we're exercising, we need to lose heat. So what will happen is these capillaries will dilate. This is constriction. They will dilate or widen, and we have the encouragement of blood into these vessels, these capillaries, and we will lose heat across the epidermis in order to help us cool down. Heat loss by the skin is controlled by a negative feedback loop. We talked in our first lecture about what happens with a negative feedback loop when our body gets too cold, in our example of a hiker or an example of where our house drops in temperature. We're going to look at it now from a heat loss perspective. This person is exercising. They're going to get warm. There's going to be an increase in temperature. And this is going to be detected by your skin receptors. Will detect that you're warm. This information is going to be fed back to the brain, specifically the hypothalamus, the integrator, the control center, which is going to send out the appropriate response, which is going to include a few things. One, the blood vessels are going to dilate or widen at the level of the skin so that we can lose heat across the skin through a process called radiation. And we can also lose heat by the process of evaporation. And this is where your sweat glands will start to secrete sweat. This will bring your body temperature back down, which will bring us back to homeostasis. Now we'll talk about skin glands. A gland is a structure that secretes a substance. We have three main types of skin glands. These two fall under the category of sweat glands. And then we have sebaceous and ceruminous glands. Starting with the eccrine sweat glands, these are the ones that cover most of our body surface. So they're the most numerous. They're found all throughout. They're going to be responsible for our general perspiration or sweating. It helps keep us cool. We sweat more if we're exercising, of course. And it also helps eliminate waste. It's a way of getting rid of substances. Apocrine glands, these are found deeper in certain regions. Subcutaneous is beneath the top layers of skin, deep in the subcutaneous layer, and they're found in areas such as the armpit, that's the axilla, the areola of the breast, and around the anal region. And these begin to function only at puberty, and they also demonstrate changes with the menstrual cycle in females. Sebaceous glands are responsible for secreting a sebum. You can see SEB, SEB. Sebum is an oily product, and it helps keep our hair and our skin soft and pliant. It helps prevent excess water loss, and it's also antifungal in nature. They're found all throughout the dermis, but we do not have them in our palms and our fingers, fingerprints, or fingertips, and our soles. They are not present in those areas. The production of the sebaceous glands increases by the time you get to adolescence, and it's that nasty contributor to the formation of problematic skin, such as pimples and blackheads. Ceruminous glands are really a modified apocrine gland. Where they're located, though, is in the external ear canal. They can be present on their own or alongside sebaceous glands in that area, and they have a very specific function. What they do is they produce cerumen, which is wax. And the wax that we have in our ears is there to protect us from a number of different things. We know wax can help prevent against dehydration, but it also is going to protect us from other things that could get into our ear and damage it because they get trapped in the wax. So this waxy substance is actually a combination of secretions from the ceruminous glands and the sebaceous glands that form that wax. And although there are some benefits to wax, it can accumulate and block hearing and cause hearing loss in some individuals. And on our last slide, talking just about the cycle of life, much of this is pretty obvious, but children have this smooth, unwrinkled skin, lots of elasticity and flexibility, very few sweat glands at their young age, and healing is quite quick. Adults start to develop and activate their different glands, such as sebaceous and sweat glands. There's going to be an increase in sweat production, and that's the contributor to body odor. It's not just the liquid that's being released in sweat, it's the bacteria in the area that can lead to body odor. And then increased sebum production, this can result in the development of acne. And then with older age, there is a reduction in both sebaceous and sweat gland activity. And this changes the overall texture of the skin and can cause or be a contributor to wrinkling. And then also, because we're not able to sweat as much with age or as we get older, there's a decrease in the body to cool itself and maintain homeostasis. That's the end of today's lecture. Thanks so much for listening. Bye for now.